Hello, you're watching A News Today from Baku. I'm Leila Masimova. Here are the top stories. The US says it is aware of Russia's launch of an intermediate-range ballistic missile. International Atomic Energy Agency board passes Iran resolution as West pushes Tehran towards talks. Today is the official final day of the UN's largest climate conference, COP29, hosted in Baku, but the talks reached a deadlock. The United States says it is aware of Russia's launch of intermediate-range ballistic missile at Ukraine on Thursday. The White House announced it had briefed Kyiv and its allies to help them prepare.
Russia confirms firing a hypersonic intermediate-range ballistic missile at the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. Kyiv initially suggested Russia fired an intercontinental ballistic missile, a weapon designed for long-distance nuclear strikes and never before used in war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the use of the new missile amounted to a clear and severe escalation in the conflict and called for strong worldwide condemnation. The White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, says the US was aware of Russia's missile launch.
Obviously, we are aware of Russia's launch of an intermediate-range ballistic missile against Ukraine. Ukraine has withstood countless attacks from Russia. We have seen that repeatedly over the past more than 2 years now. We briefed Ukraine and our close allies, partners in recent days to help them prepare. As the president announced earlier this year, the United States is providing Ukraine with hundreds of additional Patriot and AMRAAMs missiles to strengthen its air defense.
The Pentagon also commented on the latest missile strike, stating that it was fired with a conventional warhead, but added that Moscow could modify it if desired. The Deputy Press Secretary also says the main focus for the US remains supporting Ukraine.
I mean, we've seen this type of dangerous, reckless rhetoric before from President Putin. What we're focused on is continuing to support Ukraine with what it needs.
The latest developments comes amid heightened concerns over Russia's update to its nuclear doctrine. This week, US State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller said that there is no immediate change to the US nuclear stance. However, Washington says it remains committed to urging Russia cease its provocative rhetoric.
The United Nations says it will continue discussions with Israel to find a ceasefire deal, despite the International Criminal Court's warrant arrest for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
The United Nations say, despite the International Court's arrest warrants for Israel's Prime Minister, it will continue talks with Benjamin Netanyahu to find a ceasefire deal. Netanyahu has been accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He denounces the ICC's accusations.
The anti-Semitic decision of the International Court in The Hague is a modern Dreyfus trial, and it will end the same way. It is falsely accusing me, the democratically elected Prime Minister of the State of Israel, and Israel's former Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, of deliberately targeting civilians. This when we do everything in our power to avoid civilian casualty.
The UN spokesperson, Stefan Dujarric, says they'll keep speaking out to find out more aid for Gaza as well as a way to stop the war.
Whether it's this conflict or any other, if we want to see a ceasefire, if we want to see increased humanitarian assistance, we have to speak to the people involved in the conflict. So we will continue to do so. It doesn't mean that we don't call out violations of humanitarian law when they occur. We don't condemn the killings of civilians. We will continue to speak out. We will continue to do whatever we can to ensure that there will be a ceasefire, to ensure that there will be humanitarian aid, to ensure that the hostages will be released, to ensure that we can get the Israelis and the Palestinians, as difficult as it may seem to imagine now, on a track back to a two-state solution.
Meanwhile, the US rejected the ICC's decision, criticising procedural flaws and reaffirming support for Israel, highlighting divisions over the Gaza conflict.
A landmark military cooperation agreement has been signed in Copenhagen by defence ministers from Denmark, Finland, Norway and Sweden, along with Iceland's foreign ministry representatives. The agreement aims to streamline military force deployment among these nations during peace, crisis and conflict. Norwegian Defence Minister Bjorn Arild Gram highlighted the importance of military transport corridors to boost NATO's defence capabilities. This move comes amid rising tensions with Russia over the Ukraine war. The United Nations Atomic Agency has ordered Iran to urgently improve cooperation and enter talks. The International Atomic Energy Agency's Board of Governors passed a resolution on Thursday calling for a comprehensive report to pressure Iran into renewed nuclear talks. Iran's ambassador Mohsen Nasri-Assel dismissed the resolution, which passed with only 19 votes in favor. Tehran has previously escalated its nuclear activities in response to such resolutions. The French ambassador in Haiti had been summoned by Port-au-Prince's foreign minister. It is over controversial remarks made by President Emmanuel Macron during the G20 summit in Brazil. Macron criticized the Haitian Transitional Presidential Council's recent decision to dismiss Prime Minister Gary Conille amid escalating gang violence. He called the move completely dumb, sparking outrage in Haiti. France says it is committed to staying by Haiti's side to help restore security and carry out elections. A News continues its live coverage of UN's largest climate conference, COP29. Today is the official final day of the event, but now the climate talks have reached a serious deadlock. The main issue is New Collective Quantified Goal, or NCQG, which aims to set how much funding developed countries will give to help developing nations tackle climate change. Our guys Sean and Orkan Mashov are on the ground to bring us the latest updates. Good afternoon, Guy and Orkan. Is there any insights about the negotiations?
Hi Leila, welcome back to day 12 here at COP29, and so far it's been a day of tension, anticipation and more recently drama as we've just heard negotiations on the new collective quantified goal, this collective term for the set of agreements that together are referred to as the climate finance agreement. Those talks have stalled. Developing nations, this is there's a lot of detail in this, but broadly speaking, developing nations are asking for 1.3 trillion US dollars, but only 200 to 300 billion US dollars have been offered at this point. Orkan, is this just about the value on that number, or is there more to it?
There's a great deal of complexity enveloping this discussion, of course. I mean, the fact that what is happening now could be aptly described as gridlock. Effectively, consensus has not been attained yet, but there is a way forward, of course. So the context here is that developed countries expect more ambitious fossil fuel commitments from oil exporting developing countries, and they are also citing their own internal difficulties because developed countries are massively involved in the process of supporting Ukraine, and also that they are reflecting on their commitments related to post-COVID process, and they're effectively saying that we need to hear more from developing countries about their fossil fuel commitments, and also we have many financial commitments, so we cannot afford that amount of money. That's what they're saying at this juncture. But developing countries are not buying this argument, of course, because we understand that the money, necessary financial resources are there. It's all about their proper funneling into the right course from their perspective, of course. And there have been some attempts by Western countries to reintroduce that the UAE consensus on transitioning away from fossil fuels in just, equitable, orderly manner with a stricter terminology. I think the part of the problem actually revolves around that stricter terminology, because we remember what happened at COP28. The initial suggestion there was phasing out, and the phasing out terminology was replaced with transitioning away, and that was heavily criticized back at COP28. It looks like, that's my feeling, that's my internal feeling, that actually developed countries now demanding stricter terminology regarding, actually they want to augment that transitioning away, and might have actually proposed phasing out again, and that was opposed by Saudi Arabia and some other oil exporting rich Gulf countries, I imagine. So that's a part of the problem there, of course. And the reality now is that we reached a point where we have to make a decision. We clearly understand that consensus has not been attained yet. We see those divisions. Geopolitics is part and parcel of what's going on now. China does not want to be involved within the pool of NCQG. They want to commit themselves voluntarily, and developed countries demand China and Saudi Arabia also financially to be involved as contributors. So clearly what we reach now, the stage we reach now could be aptly and properly described as gridlock, but we need to move on. So what we need to do now, we need to now actually align the sense of urgency, the necessity of achieving progress now with our broader ambition to achieve a balanced outcome for all parties involved. That means that we need to settle on that figure, which is low, of course. It could be $300 billion US dollars, or it could be $400 billion US dollars, and achieve on that basic contours. And then, of course, specific elements related to how this money will be allocated for the purposes of mitigation adaptation could be discussed during the subsequent meetings. I think that we need to act very maturely, in a drastic way, with a sense of responsibility, and need to achieve something concrete now. That ambition is nowhere near to what we set out to achieve earlier on day one, of course. And it looks like that when it comes to this transformation from the linguistic originality to actionable solution, we're actually betraying our own ambition that we set out. We talked about extensively on day one. You remember those opening remarks, the clock is ticking, we need to act now. But clock is ticking, but we can't agree. So what we should do now, we need to achieve something which is doable, fixable. And that doable is probably going to be around that 300 billion figure, of course.
And do you think we should take any confidence at all from the fact that there is at least a doable, as you say, number being described? We were hoping for the number to be in the trillions, or at least over $1 trillion US dollars. But there is at least a number, albeit a much smaller number, being discussed, being put forward at this first initial deadlock situation. Should we at least take some solace, some confidence from the fact that it looks unlikely that absolutely nothing will be agreed? It looks more likely that at least something, albeit a smaller number, could be agreed.
We all know that something must be attained. That's number one, of course. 300 billion US dollars. It's going to be tripling of the 100 billion pledge agreed back in 2009 in Copenhagen, of course. This is something, but it's not good enough. Everybody, I suppose, understands this grim reality. But now we need to exercise the art of the possible. What could be done? We know that Azerbaijani COP29 president has been working flat out around the clock over the last few days. And the reality is that when there is a danger of failing, then there's a danger of achieving absolutely nothing. What is doable should guide us. And what is doable is now is a lower figure. If you remember our last conversation, when we were delivering yesterday, we were talking about two extremes. One is 1.3 trillion US dollars. It's what that figure actually reflects what we need. But we understand that developed countries do not want to commit themselves. And we heard about 300 billion package as well. We all heard about 400 billion package as well. So the middle ground was actually $300 billion package. So my feeling back then was that we need to find a compromise, and the compromise will be centered around that figure. But now it looks like that developing countries actually compromised a lot, and that's a bare minimum. That's a bare minimum. It is what we have. But perhaps during the negotiations, that figure, which now seems to be very low to us, could be slightly increased.
Thanks, Volkan. So, Leila, we do have a deadlock, but we also do have a sense of a figure. It's a much smaller figure than everybody hoped for at the start of this event. But there are some hours to go. We are on day 12. It is technically the final day. We know that an extension, a delay is possible. So it'll be very interesting to watch over the next few hours just how much further can that figure be negotiated up closer towards that figure that, as Orkan says, was the figure that we really wanted at the start of this event. Stay tuned, we'll keep you updated here on A News.
Thank you, Guy and Orkan. And we continue with the news from COP. As the climate crisis intensifies, the voices of those most affected indigenous peoples are increasingly being recognized at international forums like COP29 in Baku. They demand action and, most importantly, respect for their rights.
From the deserts of Sonora to the Arctic tundra, indigenous peoples are at the front lines of climate change.
We are very strongly impacted. We already live in a hot, dry climate, but we've seen drought, we've seen increasing heat. We're now reaching levels that it's almost hard to grow food in the summer, and also the rainfall doesn't come at the same time. That impacts many species, plant and animal species that are part of our indigenous traditional food systems.
This challenge is felt by indigenous communities across the globe. Rising seas, extreme weather, and the loss of ancestral lands threaten their culture and way of life.
We've been feeling the impacts of climate change for decades, and so a lot of our traditions and culture are interwoven with our environment, and so the impacts of climate change might not be felt culturally for other maybe urban cultures, but for us, climate change is literally the death to our language, our culture, our people.
In the Arctic, climate shifts are particularly dramatic. The only indigenous people in Europe, the Sami in Finland, feel particularly threatened.
The snow is melting there, ice are melting there. It's much more 1.5 to 3 Celsius degrees warmer than it has been before. So, for example, now there will be minus 30 degrees, but now it's plus, and we don't know how we don't have snow. So it's very big issue for the reindeer herders in my area, because I'm also a reindeer herder.
At COP29, indigenous leaders are calling for full recognition of their rights in climate negotiations. With COP30 set to take place in the Brazilian Amazon, the urgency has never been greater.
The main issue for indigenous people, defended by the Brazilian government, is the direct access to finance. Indigenous peoples cannot be the ones that are most impacted and not receiving finance to continue their lives. So for COP29, the expectation is that they can advance and ensure direct access to the finance for indigenous people, so that by COP30 we can start talking about implementation.
As COP29 wraps up, indigenous peoples who preserve 80% of the world's biodiversity and 36% of intact forest landscapes call for recognition and action.
A China's firm won 100-megawatt Gobistan solar power plant auction. Companies from across the world demonstrated interest in the tender.
A Chinese firm has won the first renewable energy auction held in Baku. The driving force was the Azerbaijani Ministry of Energy in collaboration with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, with the goal of constructing a 100-megawatt solar power plant. Altogether, 100 companies demonstrated interest in the auction. The Chinese company Universal International Holdings Limited won the auction by placing the lowest bid for each kilowatt-hour of electricity generated. According to the ministry, the project will save 57 million cubic metres of natural gas annually and cut carbon dioxide emissions by 124,000 tonnes. Javid Abdullayev, director of the Azerbaijani Renewable Energy Agency, highlighted significant advances in the country's renewable sector.
The agreements signed in the field of renewable energy differ from those in the hydrocarbon sector. Those agreements are based solely on Azerbaijani legislation and established formalization procedures, and this has continued with today's auction. Azerbaijan also successfully presented its National Strategic Review for Hydrocarbon document, which sparked extensive discussions. We have also introduced today's auction and signed agreements with representatives from many countries regarding energy storage systems. And ongoing implementation work is underway.
The renewable energy sector has been in the spotlight for global attention during the past few years, and Azerbaijan is leading the way in the South Caucasus and has just hosted COP29.
Negotiators from around the world will convene in South Korea's Busan next week in a critical push to finalize first-ever global treaty aimed at tackling plastic pollution. However, deep divisions among countries threaten to derail the process despite 2 years of negotiations.
The talks scheduled to begin Monday represent what United Nations Environment Programme Chief Inger Anderson has called a moment of truth. Anderson stressed the urgency of the situation, warning that speculation about further delays must give way to decisive action. Plastic pollution has infiltrated virtually every corner of the planet. In 2019 alone, global production reached approximately 460 million tons, double the volume produced in 2000, and is projected to triple by 2060, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The majority of plastic, over 90%, is never recycled. More than 20 million tons leak into the environment annually, polluting oceans, mountaintops, and even human bodies. The issue also contributes to climate change, accounting for roughly 3% of global emissions, primarily through production reliant on fossil fuels.
Well, that's all we have for this hour. Please do stay with us, and thank you for watching.